Alright, so in this video we will continue our discussion of ARC section 90A as it relates to the review of financial statements. And up until this point we have agreed on some terms with our client through an engagement letter and had everyone sign it. And so now this video will discuss how we should communicate with management and those charged with governance throughout the engagement. And that's at ARC section 90A.13. And it says the accountant should communicate with management or those charged with governance as appropriate on a timely basis during the course of the review engagement all matters concerning the review engagement that, in the accountant's professional judgment, are of significant importance to merit the attention of management or those charged with governance as appropriate. So throughout the engagement, we need to keep management and those charged with governance informed on how things are going or if there's some really important stuff that they need to know. Anyway, so we've got some explanatory material here in section A23 through A29, and that will give us some more information about how to comply with this particular section. And let's go there now. Okay, so now we are in the explanatory material covering the discussion of communications with management and those charged with governance. And so there's two forms of communications that we have with management and those charged with governance. And the first is our inquiries with management in order to perform our engagement and get the information that we need to perform the engagement. And the second form is more of an administrative communication to keep management and those charged with governance informed of how things are going and to have a good working relationship for the engagement. And the appropriate timing for communications can vary depending on the circumstances of the engagement. And this might depend on the significance or the nature of the matter that we're concerned about and the action that we're expected to take and that management and those charged with governance are expected to take. And in most cases, it's probably appropriate for us to discuss with management or those charged with governance as soon as possible if there's some things that they could do to help us overcome the difficulty. But our obligation to communicate with those charged with governance may be limited by certain legal requirements, so we need to make sure that we understand our legal responsibilities through legal advice, and that's because we have a confidentiality responsibility with our client, and that obligation might be complex, so we need to make sure we understand that. Okay, so now we have a list here of items that this section suggests that we should communicate with management or those charged with governance. And the first one is our responsibilities in the review engagement, so that would have been included in the engagement letter or other written form of agreement that we've seen as a requirement in the prior videos. Next, we need to communicate our findings for the review, and that includes our view about the client's accounting practices, including their accounting policies, estimates, and financial statement disclosures. So we might let them know whether or not their accounting policies are appropriate. We also want to communicate our significant findings from the performance of our procedures. We also want to communicate with them additional procedures that we had to do beyond what we were expecting, and might also communicate with those charged with governance to make sure that we have the right understanding with the way that they view the situation before we perform those additional procedures. We would also want to communicate with those charged with governance and management matters arising that may lead to a modification of the accountant's review report. And finally, we should communicate significant difficulties that we encountered during the review. And that might mean, for example, information was unavailable that we were expecting, or we were unable to get the evidence that we need, or management imposed some restrictions on us. So we might want to communicate this item to those charged with governance as well. And sometimes these circumstances might force us to need to withdraw from the engagement. So in summary, these are all the matters that we need to communicate with management or those charged with governance to keep them abreast of how the engagement's going, as well as the results of our engagement. And here we're made aware that even if management is responsible for communicating matters to governance that are of interest to them, we ourselves still need to communicate those matters with governance, even if management has communicated those items too. So even if we know that management has communicated to those charged with governance the matters that we were going to communicate, we still need to communicate them to governance. And so next we have communications with third parties. They make note that sometimes the accountant may be required by law or regulation to notify a regulatory or enforcement body of certain matters that were communicated to those charged with governance, and also submit copies of certain reports that we gave to those charged with governance. And we should maybe submit them to the regulatory body or make them publicly available. And this is commonly done in single audits, but we need to be aware in our review engagement if we have this responsibility to communicate to anyone outside of those charged with governance. And they make certain here that we have a responsibility of confidentiality with our client. So if there's not a law that requires us to communicate with third parties, before we do so, we need to get the consent with management or those charged with governance that gives us permission to communicate with them.